of that book as a result of this webinar. And today, Richard will provide a national overview of how cities, specifically in North America, have been shaped, how our country has been shaped by racial inequity and racial inequality as a result of segregated neighborhoods. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Richard.
Well, thank you very much, Tiffany. I'll get right to it. And, as you all know, in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began by challenging racial segregation in law schools because civil rights lawyers figured that if the judges couldn't understand anything else, they might be able to figure out that you couldn't get a good legal education in a segregated and inferior law school. And that precedent was used to challenge racial segregation in colleges and universities. And then that led to Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 that you all know prohibited legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And that Brown decision gave impetus, inspiration, momentum to a civil rights movement that was already beginning to grow, been engaged in marches, demonstrations, civil disobedience, activism of all kinds. People lost their lives in that struggle, as you all know. And by the end of the 1960s, it had succeeded in convincing a good part of the country, perhaps not everybody, it's obvious not everybody, but convincing a good part of the country that racial segregation was wrong, it was immoral, it was harmful both to blacks and to whites. It was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. And yet, having done that, we succeeded in using that understanding to end segregation in public accommodations, the Greensboro sit-ins, lunch counter sit-ins. In public transportation, the Rosa Parks story. In employment. And in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act that prohibited future discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. And then at the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement pretty much ended, left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area is residentially segregated and remains so to this day. How could it be that understanding that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy, harmful to both blacks and whites, how could it be that we left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area is residentially segregated? I've lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were all black and mostly black. We prohibited future discrimination, but did nothing to undo the segregation that we've created. Well, in one sense, it's not hard to understand. It's harder, a lot harder to dismantle segregation in neighborhoods than it is to dismantle segregation in buses or in lunch counters. If you prohibit segregation in lunch counters or buses, the next day you go to any restaurant you want or you sit anywhere you want on a bus. But if we would somehow prohibit residential segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks, whites, liberals, conservatives, northerners, southerners, Democrats, Republicans, is we've adopted a rationalization, a national excuse that we give ourselves for not attempting to redress the segregation that we created. The excuse goes something like this. The segregation of buses and public transportation, interstate transportation, public accommodations, all of that was done by government. It was required by law, by ordinance. If the federal government was doing it, it was a Fifth Amendment violation. If the state, local governments were doing it, it was a 14th Amendment violation. When we violate the Constitution, it's a civil rights violation, and we have an obligation to remedy it. But we tell ourselves that racial segregation in neighborhoods, that was something entirely different. That wasn't done by government. Federal government and state governments were segregating us by race. It happened naturally. It happened because bigoted white homeowners wouldn't sell homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods, or landlords wouldn't rent to them. Or maybe it's because banks and real estate agents, actors in the private economy, not government agents, created segregated neighborhoods by the practices that they follow. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's just because blacks and whites like to live with each other at the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. We self-segregate. Or maybe we would tell ourselves it's all the result of income differences. African Americans, on average, not all, but on average, have lower incomes than whites. So many of them can't afford to move to white middle-class neighborhoods. All of these individual, personal, bigoted perhaps, but non-governmental decisions, is what's created residential segregation. And we tell ourselves that what happened naturally, what happened by accident, can only unhappen naturally. It can only unhappen by accident. We give a name to this rationalization. We all say, a term that we all use, we say we have de facto segregation, something that just happened in fact, not in law. Well, I spent many years studying education policy, trying to explain in the writings I was doing. I was a newspaper columnist for a while, trying to explain why there's an achievement gap between black and white children, why on average black children have lower achievement than white children. Again, not all, but on average. And I tried to explain that, because some of you can't hear me. Turn this up a bit. Sorry. Is that better? Yes, okay. Trying to explain why we have an achievement gap between black and white children. And I tried to explain that it was not because, as conventional political ideas have it, that teachers discriminated against minority children or had low expectations for them. We actually passed a law in 2001 called the No Child Left Behind law that said that if only we can force schools and teachers to pay more attention to minority children, the achievement gap will disappear. I thought it was a ludicrous law because that's not why we have an achievement gap. We have an achievement gap because of the social and economic conditions that black children in particular and lower income children in general have, social and economic conditions that bring them to school less able to take advantage of school. And I wrote, for example, I remember one column, which I wrote about asthma. As you may know, African American children, for example, in dense urban neighborhoods, have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle class children, 4 times the rate. If a child has asthma, the child might be up at night wheezing, sleepless. Black children have asthma at higher rates than white children on average because black children live in more polluted neighborhoods, more diesel trucks driving through their neighborhoods, more deteriorated buildings. Well, if you have 2 groups of children who are identical in every respect, except one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group, on average, is going to come to school sleepier, more drowsy from being up at night wheezing than the group that comes to school well rested. And there will be an achievement gap between those 2 groups, no matter how high teacher expectations are, and no matter how hard they try. It's going to be inevitable. And then there are so many other social and economic conditions that children from particularly lower income neighborhoods come to school with. Lead poisoning. You're familiar, I'm sure, with the disproportionate incidence of lead poisoning in black neighborhoods, low income neighborhoods, homelessness, economic insecurity. Each of these, you could do the same kind of illustration. If you had 2 groups of children who were equal in every respect, except one group had a higher rate of lead poisoning, or homelessness, or economic insecurity, that group would have lower average achievement. And when you looked at all these social and economic conditions, you pretty much explained the achievement gap. And then as I was doing this research and writing about it, I began to realize there's one thing if a child comes to school with asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity, but what happens when you have a school where every child has one or more of those conditions? How can a school like that ever be expected to achieve at the same level as a school where children come well-rested and healthy, well-nourished, and in secure homes? Obviously, it's impossible to have such an equalization of outcomes from schools like that. We passed the law, as I said, in 2001 called the No Child Left Behind law, which said that if only teachers try harder, the achievement gap will disappear in just a few years. It was nonsense. Well, we call schools where we concentrate children with these social and economic disadvantages segregated schools. And schools are segregated more today than they have been at any time in the last 50 years because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began to think that maybe as an education writer, I ought to be looking at neighborhood segregation. And that's how I came to the research that I began to write this book called The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. In 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision. The decision concerned two school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of those districts had implemented a very, very small, modest school desegregation plan. They allowed parents to choose which school their child would go to, but if the choice was going to further exacerbate racial segregation, that choice wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a child who would not exacerbate it. So, for example, if you have a school in the districts, as I say, were Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington, if you had a school in one of those places that, okay, I'm told that I'm still having a hard time hearing. Maybe I'll just hold this. Is this better? Is this better, Tahani? Okay, sorry about that. If you have a school in one of those cities that had one place left, and both the black and the white child applied for that last place, the black child would be given some preference if the school was all white or mostly white. And the Supreme Court evaluated this policy and said it was unconstitutional. It said it was unconstitutional because it said the schools in Louisville and Seattle, it's true, are segregated. But they're segregated, it said, because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. And the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated de facto, not because of government policy, but because of the things I described before, private actions, discrimination by banks and real estate agents, individual choices, income differences. And the Supreme Court said, if you have de facto segregation, not something that was done by government, then there's nothing you can do about it, nothing you're permitted to do about it explicitly. You can think it's too bad, but what happened naturally can only unhappen naturally. Well, I read this decision. It was in 2007. As I say, it concerned the school districts of Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. And I remembered reading about something that happened in Louisville some years before. In Louisville, Kentucky, there was a white homeowner in a single-family home outside the city of Louisville in a suburb called Shively. That homeowner had a friend in an African-American friend in the center city of Louisville. The friend was a decorated Navy veteran. He had a good job, a good income, wife and daughter. He wanted to buy a single-family home, but no real estate agent would sell it to him. And so the white homeowner in this single-family, all-white suburb of Shively bought a second home there and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob surrounded the home. They threw rocks through the windows. They were protected by the police. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to stop this. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And I remember reading about this, and I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the prosecutors, the courts, the entire criminal justice system was mobilized to enforce racial boundaries in Louisville, Kentucky. I began to look into it further, and I discovered that thousands and thousands of cases of mob violence protected by the police frequently in cities all over the country, not just in Louisville, but in New York, and Chicago, and Detroit, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, everywhere. There were instances of mob violence driving African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased in white neighborhoods or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of them was a constitutional violation if the police were involved in protecting the mob, and frequently the police were leading the mob, a violation of the 14th Amendment that requires a remedy, a civil rights violation. I began to wonder if there was more than state-sponsored violence that was involved in creating segregation. And I began to look into it and discovered that there was a whole range of federal, state, and local policies that created the racial boundaries that we know today. Every one of them, if it was federal, state, or local policy, was a constitutional violation that we never remedied, that we've never taken upon ourselves the obligation to remedy, and that we required as American citizens who follow our Constitution to remedy. Racial segregation is not de facto. It's an utter myth. Racial segregation is an unconstitutional creation of federal, state, and local governments, and we, as American citizens, have an obligation to remedy it. Well, let me, in the few minutes I have this morning, describe some of the major policies besides state-sponsored violence that is responsible for creating the segregation that we know today. I'll focus on two federal policies. One, public housing, something that most of us misunderstand. Public housing, we think, most of us, is a program for poor people, frequently dilapidated buildings, not well maintained, lots of very, very low-income families, single mothers with children, young men without hope or opportunity to have jobs in the formal economy, no transportation to good jobs. That's our image of public housing. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in the Depression, the 1930s, during the New Deal, the Roosevelt administration. It was not a program for poor people. It was a program for working families, middle class, lower middle class families, who could afford to rent housing, but no housing was being built for them during the Depression. We had an enormous unemployment rate in the Depression, 25% unemployment. But public housing was for the 75% who had jobs, who could afford to pay rent. It was not subsidized. It was simply built by the government and then collected rents to pay for it. The first public housing agency in this country was the Public Works Administration, as I say, in the New Deal in 1933. Everywhere that it built public housing, the first public housing in this country, it created segregated projects, frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously been known. And we had a lot more integration in the mid-20th century than we have today. Many working class downtown neighborhoods, working families didn't live in the suburbs in those days. We had very few suburbs. Lived in broadly integrated neighborhoods. They did so because we were a manufacturing economy. We didn't know internet in those days. It was all jobs making things. And factories had to be located near deep water ports or near railroad terminals so they could get their parts and ship their final products. And if you had a factory district that was employing both black and white workers, you had to, in that district, workers had to be able to live close enough to be able to walk to work, both black and white workers. In some cases, they had short streetcar rides, but no driving in from the suburbs. There were no suburbs for working class people in those days. And so you had these integrated neighborhoods that people were walking to work from. The great African-American poet, novelist, playwright, Langston Hughes, described how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. We don't think of downtown Cleveland as being that kind of a place today. But we'd be stunned if we were transported back to the mid-early 20th century to see the extent of the non-segregation that we had. Langston Hughes said he grew up in this integrated neighborhood. He said in high school his best friend was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. Not surprising, in an integrated neighborhood, an integrated high school. The Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood of Cleveland and demolished housing to build two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation with those projects and with others in Cleveland that persists to this day. And this was done everywhere in the country. In my book, The Color of Law, I try to focus where I can on self-satisfied smug places that think they're better than the places you live. Cambridge, Massachusetts, for example. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, the area between Harvard and MIT was an integrated neighborhood, about half black and half white in the 1930s. Public Works Administration demolished housing there to build two separate projects, one for blacks, one for whites, creating a pattern of segregation that hadn't previously existed. And with that and other projects, largely creating the segregation that exists in the Boston metropolitan area today. During World War II, the policy of the federal government to create residential segregation intensified. Hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of war production during World War II to take jobs in war plants. They overwhelmed these communities. If the government wanted the ships and the tanks and the aircraft carriers to be built, it had to somehow find housing for these workers, and so it did. It built housing for war workers everywhere in the country, and everywhere it built it, it was segregated. Separate projects for whites and blacks, people who were living in the same, people who were working in the same war plants were living in separate projects. In California, where I am now, there were very few African Americans living there before World War II, so you couldn't say that the government was just honoring existing patterns. Very few African Americans came to California before what we call the Second Great Migration. But when the government built housing for war workers, it created segregation that hadn't previously existed in any form. In San Francisco, for example, it built 5 war projects. 4 were for whites only in neighborhoods that were all white. 1 was for African Americans in a neighborhood that became the black neighborhood of San Francisco. And the same thing happened in Portland and Seattle and Los Angeles, other West Coast areas. Segregation was created by this government policy. After World War II, there was still an enormous housing shortage. Not only had no private housing been built during the Depression to speak of, during World War II, it was actually against the law to use construction materials to build housing for civilians. Only housing for war workers was permitted. And then millions of returning war veterans were coming home needing housing, and no housing was available for them. We had a homelessness crisis of returning war veterans after World War II, late 1940s. It was as serious as the homelessness crisis we have today. People doubled, tripled up in relatives, some living in Quonset huts and open fields. President Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt, had to address this affordable housing crisis, and he proposed a vast expansion of the National Public Housing Program. Again, not for poor people. Very few poor people were admitted to public housing. This was for returning war veterans who had jobs in the post-war economy, but for whom no housing was available. Conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat Truman's public housing program. They didn't want public housing. They said it was socialistic. The private sector should be taking care of the housing needs of returning war veterans. But just like today, the private sector wasn't taking care of the needs of working class, middle class families. It was mostly focused on building housing for the affluent. But the conservatives wanted to defeat the public housing program. They came up with a strategy that we call a poison pill strategy. A poison pill strategy in Congress is one where opponents of a bill put forward an amendment to that bill that they think can get passed. But once the amendment is adopted, the full bill comes back on the floor of the House and Senate, and a different majority, the one that passed the amendment, now finds the bill unacceptable because of that amendment. And the bill goes down to defeat. So Truman's Housing Act was subjected to an amendment. that was proposed by conservatives in Congress. The amendment said that from now on, public housing can't be segregated. No more discrimination in public housing, no more racial discrimination. They planned to vote for this amendment. It was cynical, of course. They didn't want public housing at all. They thought that Northern liberals would join them in voting for the amendment, and that would create a majority, and the amendment would be passed. And then when the full bill came up on the floor of the House and the Senate, the conservatives would flip and vote against the final bill. They would then be joined by Southern Democrats who were opposed to integrated housing but not to segregated housing, and the entire bill would go down to defeat. So liberals had a difficult choice to make. What were they going to do about this amendment? Were they going to support it, as many of them wanted to, opposing segregation in public housing, but with the result that there would be no housing built to resolve the housing crisis? Or would they oppose the segregation amendment, the non-segregation amendment rather, in order to preserve public housing as a segregated program rather than no public housing at all? It was a difficult choice. I'm not suggesting it was easy, but they decided that they had to address the affordable housing crisis and therefore opposed the non-discrimination amendment. The leading liberal in the Senate at that time was a senator from Illinois. His name was Paul Douglas. He got up on the floor of the Senate. Senator Douglas said, I want to say to my Negro friends that you'll be better off if this non-discrimination amendment is defeated and you get the housing that you need than you will be if the non-discrimination amendment is passed and you get no housing at all. Well, he persuaded his colleagues to vote against the non-discrimination amendment. It was defeated. The full bill came up on the floor of Congress as an ongoing segregated program for public housing. It passed, and we got the vast expansion of public housing that we know today. Giant towers in many cities, expansion of all kinds of public housing elsewhere, always on a segregated basis. The federal government used that vote in Congress as its justification for continuing to segregate housing in all of its programs, not just public housing. The segregated projects were then built. And very soon thereafter, a surprising development occurred in public housing. The development was this: all the white projects developed large numbers of vacancies. All the black projects had long waiting lists. Pretty soon, the situation became so conspicuous that even the most bigoted public housing official couldn't justify a situation where some of its projects were half empty and others had long waiting lists. So soon all the projects were opened up to African Americans. At about the same time, industry left the cities. It no longer needed to be located in their deep water ports or railroad terminals. We're now talking about the mid-1950s. Highways were being built. Factories could be located near those highways out in rural areas or in suburban areas, and they could get their parts and ship their final products by truck. So good jobs began to disappear from the urban areas where African Americans were living in public housing and in rented apartments in the private market. Pretty soon, they could no longer afford to pay the full cost of housing in their rent. The government began to subsidize the projects. It began then to not maintain them well. The projects deteriorated, and we got the kinds of urban slums that we associate with public housing today. But that's not how it began. The question is, why did all the white projects develop large numbers of vacancies and the black projects have long waiting lists? After all, these are all returning war veterans, black and white, who had jobs in the post-war economy. They could afford housing. Why did the whites leave and the blacks stay? And that was because of another federal program that was even more powerful in creating segregation than anything I've talked about so far. And that was a program of the Federal Housing Administration that was explicitly designed to, on a racial basis, to move white working class and middle class families out of urban areas into single family homes and suburbs. We were not, as I say, a suburban country at that time. We were created as a suburban country by these federal programs. The federal government subsidized builders to build whites-only projects on an explicit racial basis, suburban subdivisions in suburbs around every metropolitan area of this country, everyone. But the most famous of these is probably Levittown, east of New York City, 17,000 homes in one place. What bank would be crazy enough to lend the developer, his name was William Levitt, the money to build 17,000 homes in one place? No bank would be crazy enough to do it. They didn't even think people would want to live in the suburbs. We were in the suburban country at that time. Levitt had no buyers yet for the homes. It was purely a speculative dream on his part. He couldn't get the financing to build this development. The same is true of developers all over the country who wanted to build suburban homes, from San Francisco to Los Angeles to Chicago and Detroit and Montgomery and everywhere in between. Levitt could only build this development, and the other developers had the same problem. They could only build it if they went to the Federal Housing Administration, an agency of the federal government, made a promise never to sell a home to an African American. The federal government even required these developers to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. With these commitments, the federal government then guaranteed the developers bank loans, and the suburbs all over the country were created on this segregated basis. Whites were able to move out of public housing, for example, and if they were returning war veterans, as many of them were, could get these homes with no down payment, with a VA, the Veterans Administration, or FHA loan. They paid less in their monthly housing charges in these single-family homes in the suburbs than they were paying for rent in public housing. It was an enormous subsidy program of the federal government to move whites only out of cities into these suburbs. African Americans were prohibited from participating in this program and remained renting in urban areas. What was the result? Well, the homes in these suburbs were initially very inexpensive. Levittown homes sold for, in today's money, about $100,000. Very inexpensive homes. Any family, working class family, lower middle class family with a job and no down payment can afford a mortgage on a $100,000 home. African Americans were prohibited from participating in this program. Whites were subsidized to do so. But over the next couple of generations, those homes gained in value in all of these suburbs. They no longer sell for $100,000. They sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, in some places much, much more. The white families who participated in this program gained equity, wealth, from the participation in this program, from the appreciation of the value of their homes. They use that wealth to send their children to college. They use it to, to finance medical emergencies, perhaps, their own retirements. And they use it to bequeath wealth to their own children, who then have down payments for their own homes. African Americans are prohibited from participating in this program. The result is that today, African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. There's a whole story behind that. I won't go into that, but 60%. You'd expect if there was a 60% income ratio, there'd be a 60% wealth ratio as well. People can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in fact, the difference between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, and we've never remedied. That wealth gap is the single most important determinant of ongoing racial segregation in this country today. It persists. It's largely the result of unconstitutional federal housing policy. The other results of this segregation policy are also fairly serious. I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, the achievement gap in schools, a direct result of racial segregation. We have health disparities between African Americans and whites because so many African Americans live in more polluted neighborhoods, less access to healthy food, to health care, higher rates, therefore, of heart disease and cardiovascular diseases of all kinds, diabetes. It's a cause of the mass incarceration crisis that I'm sure all of you are familiar with. We wouldn't have that kind of crisis. The disparate incarceration of young black men if we weren't concentrating those men in lower income, disadvantaged neighborhoods where they had no access to good jobs or transportation to get them. And I think the policies, the unconstitutional policies that we've followed to create the segregation is also largely responsible for the very, very dangerous and frightening political polarization that we have in this country today. It's not all entirely racial, but it largely tracks racial lines, as we all know. How can we ever expect to create the common national identity that we need to preserve this democracy if so many Africans, Americans, and whites live so far from each other that they have no ability to identify with each other or to understand each other's life experiences? So these are the consequences of the unconstitutional policies that we've pursued in order to create residential segregation. As I mentioned, and these are just a couple of them, in my book, The Color of Law, I describe many, many other unconstitutional policies pursued by federal, state, and local governments to create segregation. The policies to redress segregation are well known. No mystery about it. The housing experts, many of you know what we need to do. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that's going to demand that those policies be implemented, that's going to make it uncomfortable to maintain policies of segregation, to maintain segregated neighborhoods, in the same way that the civil rights movement in the 1960s made it uncomfortable to maintain other forms of segregation. Before this pandemic occurred and before the national shutdown, I was working with a group of national civil rights leaders to create a new national committee to redress segregation in housing. Of course, we've put that effort on hold now. When we emerge from this pandemic, we're going to have enormous crises of homelessness that have to be addressed just on a humanitarian basis. Addressing the segregation of those homes may not be everybody's highest priority. But we're going to resume creating this once life returns to normal in some form. If any of you are interested in getting the announcement when we are ready to launch this new national committee to redress segregation in housing, you can send me an email. My email is widely available. I'll say it once now, but you can look me up on the web, and it's not hidden. It's RIROTH at EPI.org. RIROTH at EPI.org. We'll be creating committees all over the country that are aimed to insisting on policies that not only create affordable housing, but that redress segregation in housing. Too many of our policies today, let me say, too many of our policies today make the same mistake that Paul Douglas made in 1949 of putting housing affordability so far up front that we ignore the need to create non-segregated housing. The low-income housing tax credit, for example, the biggest program that the federal government has to subsidize the housing of the lowest income families, has a policy written into the policy that places a priority on placing more low-income housing in already low-income segregated neighborhoods, reinforcing that segregation. That's crazy. We need a civil rights movement that's going to demand that low-income people have access to high-opportunity neighborhoods where there are good jobs and transportation to them and healthy food and clean air and schools that have higher performance. So that's the kind of thing that I hope to see in the future once this pandemic shutdown ends. The policies like the one I just mentioned are well known. What we need is the political will to create those policies. As in past times, that political will can only be created by a movement of activists who are determined to correct the unconstitutional actions of our government that created the apartheid system that we have today. So thank you very much, and I'd be glad to answer questions as long as you like.
Richard, thank you so much. And again, I know a few of you couldn't hear earlier, but it's recorded. It's on our Facebook page. So make sure you visit our Facebook page to go back and review this panel. I just want to, before we get into questions, reiterate what I heard Richard say at the end, and it is something that I firmly believe in, and that is we need a new movement. We need a new civil rights movement, and there are great people on the ground, grassroots organizers who are out in the trenches. And so I'm definitely going to spread the word for them to get involved. Richard, I'll pass along your email address again. But as well as the people who are on the call, you know, make sure you spread this information, because without a new movement and without political will, we won't be able to correct this problem that the government created. So Richard, really quickly in the Q&A box, we had an earlier question, which was, could you give the name of the 2007 Supreme Court case again?
Sure. It was called Parents Involved in Community Schools, Supreme Court case. If, again, you email me, I can give you the exact Supreme Court citation. But it was called Parents Involved in Community Schools, and it was a case that concerned the districts of Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. The Supreme Court said that it was unconstitutional to try to desegregate schools explicitly because of the de facto segregation. That's the case where Chief Justice John Roberts made the obnoxious statement that the way to stop discriminating on race is to stop discriminating on race. In other words, that the way we end segregation is to not pay attention to it.
Okay, thank you. And we do have another question from the chat. Do you see any correlation between housing segregation and the high rates of COVID-19 diagnoses for African Americans in major metropolitan areas?
Well, of course. What we know is that the way to prevent the spread of this virus is social distancing, and people who are living in more crowded, overcrowded neighborhoods, who have less adequate housing, less space in their housing, who have sometimes multiple families living in the same apartment, but apartments that are too small even for the single families that occupy them, people who are more frequently homeless. These are all consequences of the policies of segregation that we created, and it makes the virus easier to spread. So there's a direct correlation between the policies of segregation and the higher rates of infection and death by African Americans.
Okay. We have another question. How do you see, and I think you've answered it somewhat, but how do you see the current pandemic exacerbating the segregation already locked into our society?
Well, I can only repeat what I just said.
Yeah,
I won't do it. I think
okay.
I answered that question, yeah.
Yeah. I'm looking at the chat and our question box as well. You answered the Supreme Court question. Are there any more questions? Okay, I'm going to also put in the chat box a list of resources that I have from Richard. And these are just additional links. I do encourage you all, there's a 17-minute animated film, Segregated by Design. It offers a really good explanation of mostly everything that Richard has said with regard to his book. And Richard, I do have a question. I know you talked about it briefly in the beginning, but about the achievement gap and housing segregation. We know we look at the achievement gap, but we also look at how funding is allocated to schools. And I know specifically looking at Montgomery, the dollar amount is really high, but what you see coming out of the school systems doesn't correlate with that. Can you expound on that and how segregation continues to drive just with regard to, you know, to education?
Well, we certainly need vastly more funding of schools that serve the most disadvantaged children, because that funding is necessary to try to offset to some extent the social and economic conditions that I described before that bring children to school less able to take advantage of what schools have to offer. Uh, we know, for example, the achievement gap is well established by age 3.
Mm-hmm.
Age 3. Unless we have high quality early childhood programs available to all families, that will persist, and it will be impossible for schools, no matter how much funding they get, to undo that. Now, I'm not minimizing the importance of more funding. We need more funding. We already actually, in most cases, give more funding to schools that serve low-income families through the federal Title I program than typical middle schools have. It's already the case, but not nearly enough for the enormous needs that these schools have to offset the social and economic disadvantages that are so essential to schools. In one of the articles that you just um, uh, circulated to your audiences, I described the differences, for example, during this crisis, when children are being homeschooled, of the kind of homeschooling that children of highly educated parents get, compared to the homeschooling that children of more less well-educated parents get. Clearly, parents who are better educated are better able to homeschool their children than parents who are less educated. So the achievement gap is going to grow in this coronavirus crisis. If parent education didn't make any difference, we wouldn't need to require that school teachers have college degrees. Right. It takes some skill to transmit this education. So the achievement gap is not only a product of social and economic conditions. Not only can greater funding not entirely erase it, but it's going to grow in the current crisis.
Okay. We do have another question. Can you talk about the connection between property taxes, housing policy, and inequities in school districts? That's coming from Montgomery, Alabama. That question is coming, but we know it's everywhere.
Well, it's not actually everywhere. Not every state depends so heavily on property taxes as some states. In some states, schools are financed primarily by state sales taxes and state income taxes. And what you find is that the achievement gap is just as great in states where education is financed through the state treasury as it is in states where it's financed through local property taxes. It's not to say, again, that we are spending enough in schools. We're not spending nearly enough in the schools serving disadvantaged children. But we shouldn't think that eliminating dependence on property taxes, which is part of the problem, but eliminating dependence on property taxes is not going to eliminate the most important cause of the achievement gap, which is the social and economic disadvantages which residential segregation imposes on so many children and on their ability to take advantage of what even highly funded schools have to offer.
You know, Richard, living here now, that's oftentimes the argument that we hear. If we just increase property taxes, if we increase the millage, then the schools will be better. And what you just said is that there needs to be something else added to that fight. What can you recommend that those of us who are on the front line, what can we do to make sure that we're raising the issue of housing segregation along with the issue of inequities that we see in our schools?
Well, let me say first that I'm not suggesting that raising more money won't help. Of course it will. Of course, increasing the revenue that schools get will permit them to try to address these issues more than they presently can. But the fundamental underlying cause of school segregation and the inadequacy of schools in their ability to offset the social and economic conditions that children come to school with, this most important condition creating that is housing segregation, neighborhood segregation. So how do you address it? Well, we need to begin to focus on it. We're not focused on it. We have never, in this country, the civil rights movement has never accepted a responsibility to address the issue of residential segregation. We're too willing to accept it as part of the natural environment. As I said, we all, blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, we all of us accept this notion of de facto segregation. And if we accepted the fact, understood this history, understood that it's not de facto, it was created by government, and that we, every one of us, American citizens, has an obligation to do something about it because it is unconstitutional, then we will begin to address it. But we need to understand the history first, and then we need to organize. We need to organize a civil rights movement that's not only focused on affordable housing. Again, affordable housing is important, but if we're building all or most of our affordable housing in already low-income segregated neighborhoods, we are reinforcing the segregation and making the problem in the long run more difficult to solve, as did the compromise that Paul Douglas and his colleagues made in 1949. We're making exactly the same mistake now that he made then. We do have an affordable housing crisis. There's no question that we need to address it. But if we only address it, or primarily address it, by creating more affordable housing in low-income segregated neighborhoods, the long-run consequences of this is not going to be pretty.
Does anyone want to, do we have any additional questions? Okay, so if not, I want to again thank you so much, Richard, for being with us today. Thank you for clarifying some questions. I know I learned some additional things today that I, of course, I had them wrong. So thank you so much for clarifying some of those issues for me, because as we know, the more we know, the more that we can be out on the front lines advocating as well. So thank you, everybody, and you all enjoy the rest of your week. Richard, thank you, and I'll follow up with you after the call.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.